personal interest to me. And so I hope you can kind of tell my enthusiasm for this line of work. And as Melissa noted, she gave you a kind of background about who I am, but the only thing I will add, and there's so much to say, but so little time, is that I started off as an elementary school teacher in my native California, in Los Angeles, California specifically. And the long and short of it is that I taught across different grade levels in a very short span of time, because I purposely changed grade levels each year, and I taught summer school at a different grade level. So I had a nice experience across the elementary school years. And what really drove me to graduate school was my fourth graders. And it sounds almost like I'm making this up in terms of like the fourth grade slump that you might have heard about, but I really am not making that up. It was really my fourth grade group that got me really feeling that I was not equipped with the knowledge base I needed to support their reading comprehension development. And so I felt I had a pretty strong understanding of how to support word reading skills. And by that, I should really mean that I had a good curriculum that was pretty scripted and that helped me with that word reading skill part of the task of making meaning from text. But in terms of the knowledge and conceptual development that is necessary for making meaning from the text you read, the goal of reading, I just felt at a loss. And I also felt that I was just anecdotally, because I hadn't conducted a study and nothing of the sort, but I felt that a certain subset or subgroups of the population I served were struggling comparatively more disproportionately. So what I mean is a lot of students who came from homes where a language other than English was spoken seemed to have additional challenges, or from lower income homes. And I just knew, even at that point, that was many moons ago, that there was nothing cognitively inferior about that subset of students. So that sounds so obvious and hopefully preaching to the choir, but I just felt like, so what is it and what can I do to better support these students? So I thought I was going to go into a program to become a reading specialist and learn more about the scientific underpinnings of reading comprehension development. And I did do that at the Harvard Ed School, but I ended up staying on for my doctorate because I really felt that after, it was a 9-month program, basically very intensive, that I was not going to get enough. And there was no way that in 9 months I was going to learn all I needed to know about reading comprehension development and the factors that influence that development. So I stayed on for my doctorate, and, ultimately all of my work has really been anchored on that same goal of better understanding in an effort to better support students' reading comprehension development. And the role of language has become more and more central to the work that I do, hence the title of my presentation. So I hope that's a little sprinkle of kind of what led me to this line of research. And I've been a faculty member since I graduated with my doctorate at different institutions. And most recently, I am at Peabody College in the Department of Special Education. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. What I have in terms of an agenda for this morning is that I have a couple of slides, not too much, on reading and the social demographic landscape here in the United States. And then I really, given the topic and the audience, I really felt that I wanted to share, there's so hard to pick what to share in a short span of time, to share some work that I have done related to teacher beliefs and the influence of teacher beliefs on students, English learners' reading comprehension outcomes. So I'll share that. It was published not too long ago, that piece. And then we'll really get into I think the meatier part of the presentation, which is all anchored on what I'm calling the centrality of language assessments and language comprehension broadly in the service of reading comprehension. I have a couple of bullet points in terms of takeaways and as what I see as opportunities, and then I hope we can engage in a discussion. All right, so let's start off with the first part. So many of you have probably seen something like this. I did not make this up. This is taken directly from NAEP. And it is an example of a 4th grade question. So on page 2, the story says that the soldier kept the horse as, quote, a kind of souvenir. This means that the horse, and the students select the response. I have to say, they're not reading this in isolation as a vocabulary item. They must have read a passage anchored on this question in order to answer it correctly, because that quotation is what's in quotation marks is taken directly from a passage that they would have read. And then here are the comprehension questions. So the correct answer would have been A, in this context. And if you know anything about the word souvenir, independent of the passage, you may have already been able to address this. But if you didn't, the context of the passage should have given you sufficient information to answer this. So this is, I'm not as good on these polls, et cetera. So I was going to ask you all, what do you think was a percentage of students who answer it right? But I'm going to be boring and just show it to you. So first of all, this is, like I said, a 4th grade passage just from last year. And this type of item is classified as an integrate and interpret because they have to pull in information from the passage, as I mentioned. It's not like a straight up vocabulary item. And it's considered to be of medium difficulty. And as you can see, it's a multiple choice question. So here is the bar graph that shows you the percentage of students who answered this item correctly. So just over half got it correctly. So you can look at the glass half full or half empty, right? But that means that just about half of the students missed this item. So you might say, all right, so what are you getting at with this? So what I'm getting at is, well, what does it take for students to answer these, not this particular item, but these types of items correctly? And this is taken directly from NAEP, right? The nation's report card. This is where we get our stats of how the nation is doing in terms of reading achievement. And so some people love, some people hate different conceptualizations of reading. I happen to be a fan of the Scarborough strands, and not because I think these are the only factors that influence reading comprehension, but at minimum, to answer pretty much any reading comprehension question correctly, students must A, be able to actually read the printed word. That's what's in blue, the word recognition. Otherwise, it's not reading comprehension, right? If you're not able to actually read the printed text. But that cannot be sufficient in any way, shape, or form, because you also need to understand what those words mean in the passage or passages that you are reading. So that's what's in red, the language comprehension component. And so if you have these two skills as like the minimum bar, the idea is that you are probably going to be a skilled reader, that you will be able to make meaning from the text that you read. So this is like a conceptualization of the simple view of reading, which again, some folks dislike because, oh, it's too simple. There's so much more involved in reading and its development. And of course, there are a lot of other things like executive function skills, like the context in which you're learning, the opportunities to learn. But this is, in my view, the minimum of what you would need to actually read the printed words, to understand what those printed words mean. And so what ends up happening is that over the years, we have had a lot of knowledge building, I think, in terms of the factors that influence reading comprehension. And this is really nice for those. I have a feeling most of you are very familiar with this strand, but I do want to point out the kind of weaving in of the strands, which is super important. So the word recognition skills should become increasingly automatic, as you can see on the bottom, right? Ideally, students will become just have this automaticity in word recognition skills, at some point in the late primary grade years. In contrast, language comprehension skills should become increasingly strategic over time. And the kind of language structures that are encountered in the text student read are becoming more and more sophisticated over time. Just think of a typical kindergarten passage compared to a 5th or 6th grade passage, right? Where really what we're now going to see is a lot of variation in reading comprehension performance depending on students' language comprehension skills. So we have known this kind of conceptualization for quite a while. And in fact, we have known that this is applicable to students who are not monolingual English speakers as well. So this is from work that I did several years ago now with Noni Lasso. And the short of it is that early language skills are actually quite predictive of later reading comprehension outcomes. So I would just draw your attention to the bottom part here where we have in red, English language-based skills are predictive later on. And so in this study, and I can go to in more detail, we don't have too much time right now, but I'd be happy to go offline with anyone that's interested to discuss this paper and these findings more. But I think the biggest takeaway is that we tend to have a kind of focal area on word-based skills, understandably, in the primary grade years, but the language-based skills are so important, and not just over time, but they can actually help predict who might go on to experience reading difficulties or not. So it behooves us to really focus on both areas, which is exactly what I think we should be doing as a field. And even though we know quite a bit about factors that influence reading comprehension development, this is the national profile: persistent low reading achievement. So you probably know this stat like the back of your hand, but it is about 1 in 3 US students who can read at or above the proficient level based on the NAEP assessment. Coincidentally, I'm the mom of 3 boys, 3 of a kind. And if I was told that one of them will be able to read at or above the proficient level, that would not be satisfactory to me. And I think as a nation, this is definitely not something that that we as educators will take as being sufficient and a good enough amount of students, percentage of students that can read proficiently. So then it begs a whole lot of questions about, like, why might we continue with this low or this persistently low trend of low reading achievement? And there's a whole lot of reasons, and never could this such a complex issue be treated as, okay, I have the single magic answer. But I do want to share a couple of thoughts on our current testing system in the US. On average, there is variation. Clearly, I'm aware of that. Some schools that I think are doing, or districts and states, better jobs than other in terms of the reading achievement of the students that they serve. So what tends to happen, though, is that, as I mentioned and alluded to earlier, there tends to be a big focus on the development of word reading skills, on learning letters and their corresponding sounds in the primary grade years. And that is absolutely necessary. As I mentioned, the word recognition skills need to be as automatic as possible for successful reading comprehension. And so our testing happens to be focused on that level at word recognition. And there's a lot of assessments, or at least a good amount of assessments, that can actually be administered pretty fast and can show progress, ideally. Or, you know, if you're not seeing progress, that's reason to intervene, but that you can administer for, like, for example, a 1-minute reading fluency test and get a snapshot of how the student is doing and work on that aspect of word recognition skills. But when we think about the other hugely important component, which is language comprehension, we are not doing a very good job of assessing those skills at the earliest ages. I would beg to say even at later ages, but certainly not at the beginning of this schooling years, let's say K2. But there is one big exception. And if anyone was on the panel that I was on yesterday listening in, I mentioned this a bit, but I'll elaborate a little bit more now, is that the one exception is when we test students who come from homes where a language other than English is spoken. And I have some slides on that, so I won't get into it too much. But the idea is that those students, based on a home language survey, whose parents say there's another language spoken, are flagged as potentially not having the necessary academic English language skills. Aside from that subgroup, it's very variable who gets assessed on language. And it is not a finger pointing and saying that this is, wow, teachers and schools are doing a terrible job. Honestly, it's limitations at the level of developing assessments that are valid and reliable to use with any child. And even more complicated when we think about children who are negotiating more than one language. So what happens is we tend to have this profile of students doing generally okay. And once they hit, as I mentioned, that 4th grade slump, or, you know, post the primary grade years, suddenly we have this surge of reading difficulties. And it's like, well, students are not understanding what they're reading. Well, I think that we can change this and, you know, have a shift if we were to assess language comprehension skills earlier on and provide sustained support on language development, conceptual knowledge development, which is essential for making meaning from the text that you are reading. If the children learn to read the printed words, but do not know what those words mean, that cannot lead to successful reading comprehension, the meaning making. So enough of, I know, I'm sorry, that sounds like so like depressing, but it's a real issue that we continue to tackle. And so now let me tell you a little bit about terminology so that we're all on the same page. And there are so many labels and terms used, and usually there's a meaning behind them. So what I want to do is, I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially when we're thinking about multilingual learners, which is the focus of this conference, this virtual conference, there is another term that you may or may not be familiar with. That's a big umbrella term, NELB. And that is non-English language background. already that term kind of sounds deficit oriented, right? It's what you don't have, which is English language skills. But this group basically encompasses anyone who is not English monolingual. I hope that makes sense. So you would have everyone who's English monolingual, and then everyone else who would fall under the umbrella term of NELB. Within that population, there are these other configurations, these subgroups. On the very left side, you see students who I'm calling never EL, because these would be students who never qualified for English language support, because even though they came from a home where a language other than or in addition to English was used, they were proficient in English from the get-go. So they never got the EL label. Then you have that middle bucket, which are former English learners. And these are students who used to be classified as a current English learner. And every year they get tested, as you know, and they were reclassified as English proficient. So they used to be English learners. And finally, you have the group that has received the most attention, understandably, which is current English learners. And those are students who have been identified as not having the necessary academic English language skills to access the curriculum in English, and therefore are offered services. As a quick aside, and if anyone has questions about this, let me know. Just because you are identified for accountability purposes as an English learner, the parent or guardians do not have to accept those services. The vast majority accept the services, so they actually receive them, but there is another subset whose parents waive those services, and those are called waived ELs. And it is a very interesting group and very unique-ish social demographic profile that we can talk about later, but that I have done some research on as well. So I hope this is making sense. If anyone has questions about that, let me know. But these are, and I really like to showcase this only to let everyone know that there is a lot of diversity within a group that is sometimes thought of as being pretty homogeneous. Okay, so then now we get into the slides of like what I feel is an inequitable process in terms of the language assessment, but only for these students who are potentially going to be identified as English learners. So there's a home language survey that every parent fills out this survey that includes these 3 questions in some iteration. I won't read them to you, but the point is they're trying to gauge, is there a language other than English, only English spoken in the home? If the answer is yes to any of these, then this is what happens. Well, first of all, you get the screener if you're not English monolingual, as I mentioned. You might pass the screener, so you are considered English proficient. If not, then hold on, English learner, and you're monitored until hopefully you reach English proficiency. Not everyone reaches English proficiency. So those are long-term English learners, which we'll talk about momentarily. And so, as I mentioned, there is a lot of diversity. I mean, like super diversity, I would say, within this population. So if nothing else, I want you to take away that point. That being said, the vast majority of English learners in the US are effectively US-born US citizens. They are also predominantly from Spanish-speaking homes. That is not taking away from the hundreds, like 400-ish languages spoken in the homes of English learners in the US, but the vast majority continues to be from Spanish-speaking homes. And also there is variation in terms of the instructional context. Some are in dual language programs, whether it's early exit or late exit, tons of configuration. But again, the vast majority in the United States are educated in English-only contexts. It's a reality. It's not something I'm making up. And this is a young population, with the majority being in the elementary school grades. And over and over and over and over again, we have the last bullet point, which is that we get this message that this population is lagging behind their English proficient peers. Well, this makes all the sense in the world if you are a student who is in the process of acquiring English language skills, but the assessments that you are being administered are in English only, right? If I'm learning French and you give me a French reading comprehension assessment and I'm not yet proficient in French, I'm probably not going to rock that test because I'm still in the process of learning. So this conceptualization is really problematic. And we get a profile something like this. And this is actually optimistic. If you recall the 1 and 3 from earlier, Now we have a profile that actually is something like 8% of fourth graders and 4% of eighth graders who are classified as English learners in the US score at or above the proficient level in reading. Again, this is an English reading, but also keep in mind what I just shared about being US born US citizens, instructed in English only context from the very beginning for the most part. So all of this begs a whole lot of questions of what is going on? Why is this population continually appears to be struggling far more than their peers who are English proficient? And I do want to underscore, it's super important to underscore that this is not to suggest that students who are English monolingual are just off the charts in achievement in English reading comprehension, because as a nation, before disaggregating by any subgroup, it's just 1 in 3 that can read proficiently. It's just that the situation looks far worse if you're not proficient in English. So I hope that's making sense. And there are so many factors we can pinpoint to. I just sprinkled in a few of the reasons that we might think about the persistently low achievement of this subset called English learners in the US. So you can just kind of take a glance at those. This is not an exhaustive list in any way, shape, or form. And so we think, all right, so are English learners somebody else's problem? Is this like not applicable to my state or my district or the area where I will be working? And no, that is not the case. English learners are everywhere. Nationwide, about 10% of students are English learners. And remember, this is a very specific subset, those that are not yet proficient in English. The NELB population itself is far larger at about 30-something%, right, of students who have a language other than only English spoken in the home. But this just gives you a kind of snapshot of the distribution of English learners across the country. And then, super importantly, in my view, we have changing or changed student demographics in the sense that the largest increase in the number of English learners has happened in an area often called the American South, right? Or sometimes referred to as new destination states. Because a state like California, where I was born and raised, is often considered a historical immigrant or English learner state, where they're accustomed to serving this population. But in states like Arkansas or Tennessee or Alabama, Mississippi, there has been a huge increase in the last couple of years, or almost for a decade actually now. But that's where the highest growth has been concentrated. And this is really an important point because we need to think about the extent to which the educator workforce nationwide is equipped with the knowledge base that they need to be able to most effectively serve this very already large and growing population of learners anchored on linguistic diversity. And so that segues to the next part that I want to discuss, which is the teacher beliefs. And this is an area that I have been really interested in. So as I mentioned, because of the rapid linguistic growth in today's classroom, I feel that this really requires that general education teachers, not just specialists, for example, English learner specialists, really have a deep and broad understanding of English learners' unique linguistic needs to know how to best support them in terms of their overall academic achievement, certainly their reading achievement. And so I conducted a study with my then doc student, now a postdoc at the University of Virginia, Min Oh, to really explore this area of teachers and linguistic diversity in the classroom. So these are things that you may already be very familiar with. I won't spend too much time on, but you have seen already, probably already knew about the changing or changed student demographics in the United States. But despite that change, the teacher workforce itself remains mostly unchanged and mostly linguistically homogeneous. Teachers also tend to report feeling unprepared to meet the needs of multilingual learners, which is really understandable. It's not a fault of their own, right? It's in terms of what kind of preparation are they getting. And there is some evidence showing that teachers may actually hold deficit-oriented beliefs and attitudes in terms of the abilities of the English learners that they are serving. And this is something that we really need to address and, tackle on. So what we did in brief, I can tell you a lot more about this paper, but we conducted basically like a survey, a questionnaire that we distributed to teachers in the American South, and they filled this out. And you might say, oh, they're not going to tell you what they really believe. Well, most of the time, believe it or not, people are pretty frank and honest about, and this is anonymous, so it's not like we knew who was filling out what, right? So it makes it even more likely that they will tell you what they actually believe and think. And we wanted to just characterize their beliefs. And we bucketed this into the gray side, which is the left, which is development-focused beliefs. And on the right side, you will see the on black, what we are calling instruction-focused beliefs. And the idea is that we just really wanted to get a broad sense of what do they believe about dual language development and instruction. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And so what we found out after we did component analysis, et cetera, we had 3 developmental focused beliefs, which is 2 monolingual views. I'll tell you what this means in a bit. Acid view and bilingual development understanding. And under instruction focused beliefs, we had these buckets called lenient expectations, English standard, and English only achievement. And what we wanted to do is figure out if there was some kind of relationship, nothing causal, just a relationship between the beliefs that teachers report that they hold and the achievement of the students who are English learners in their classroom, specifically their English reading comprehension achievement. And this is what we found. We found that there was a positive relationship between teachers who reported an acid view and a bilingual development understanding, meaning that the teachers who held these beliefs tended to have students in their classroom who had higher English reading comprehension achievement. And so for acid view, these were the type of items. Young children exposed to 2 languages naturally master both, and young children can easily keep 2 languages separate and use each when necessary. In terms of bilingual development understanding, teachers who held a belief that children learn the language at school from peers and siblings, so it's not necessary that the parent teach them that language, and when children use words and letter sounds from the first language in writing and English in school, it's evidence that a child is making use of all of their linguistic resources. So teachers who held these views tended to have a positive relationship with the English reading comprehension outcome of their students. On the other hand, there were 2 beliefs that were negatively related to their students' English reading comprehension outcomes. Again, these are English learners. And that was having lenient expectations and having a mindset of English only achievement. So this is what I mean. For lenient expectations, the items were such that a teacher would say, when a child is hesitant to speak in the language of the classroom, in our case, English, teachers should wait until the child speaks on his or her own. It may sound reasonable, and we can talk about that in a second. Or it is appropriate to use grade level text to teach ELs when their reading ability is below grade level. Or effort is more important than achievement when I assess ELs. So these are the type of items that teachers believe that we bucketed under something we're calling lenient expectations. And having these types of beliefs was negatively related to their students' English reading comprehension. Similarly, having an English-only achievement characterization was negatively related. So these were the type of items. It's okay for ELs to disengage from the most academically difficult parts of a lesson. Or it is not fair to other students when I give ELs accommodations on assignments. And finally, it is good practice to lessen the quantity of coursework for ELs. We can probably already have our wheels turning as to why these types of items were related to negative achievement in terms of English reading comprehension for students. So what did we take away from this? And this is up for interpretation. This is not like final and what we think is the right thing, right? But what we really distilled from this is that it's really important to foster asset-based and evidence-based practices when supporting English learners' reading achievement. That having, I think it is well-intentioned leniency really underscores how important it is to actually have appropriately challenging content and high quality linguistic input for ELs, as opposed to, it's okay, you don't have to do this. And last, but certainly not least, and everyone hates this whole, oh, more PD, but I really think that we need some PD and sustained, not a here's one workshop for 60 minutes, one and done, but sustained PD and training, ongoing training opportunities to cultivate these research-informed teacher beliefs about English learners' language development and learning. That is going to be really important if we are to move the needle and better support our students in our classrooms who are English learners. Okay, so now I will get to what I'm calling the meatier part, not that the other ones were not, about the centrality of language assessments. All right, so I won't spend much time on that first bullet, although I just wanted to alert you that that's important in terms of centrality of language. We talked about what I think is a inequitable process that only English or potential English learners are screened for language across all domains. But what I'll talk about instead for a couple of minutes is this really complicated issue of special education identification among this group of students, and very much related to that, academic expectations. All right, so I mentioned a little earlier that there's no lack of terminology and labels for this population, but there's another one that you may have heard of, long-term English learners. And long-term English learners are literally students who are not making progress to English proficiency within roughly a 6-year timeline. That means that they have been in kinder, first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade. And every year that they take that English proficiency assessment to find out if they will be reclassified as English proficient, they are not meeting the threshold. So they continue to be classified as English proficient. And this is, again, with the backdrop of that the vast majority are US-born, US citizens instructed in English-only context. So it begs questions about, well, is there a learning disability? Is it because something's going on that this child needs additional support? Reading is language-based, right? I mean, absolutely language-based. So this is typically an area of concern for English learners. So when we think about this very complicated intersection of learning disability, and in this case, specific learning disability, which subsumes reading comprehension difficulties and English learners, it's so hard. And this is an area that I've been focusing on more over the last couple of years. So it could be related to limited English proficiency, but it could very well be related to a lack of appropriate instruction and opportunity to learn, right? In this case, in reading. I certainly am not saying that it's impossible for a student to have a specific learning disability, like reading difficulties, and be limited English proficient. That is obviously a profile that exists where you're duly classified as an EL in special education. But it gets really tricky due to, at minimum, valid assessment limitations and this big question of disproportionality of linguistically diverse learners in special education. So what I wanted to do first is focus a little bit on this area of the need for valid assessments. If you recall from earlier, I showed you the same slide, which is the conceptualization that both word reading and language-based skills influence later reading comprehension. But this study was done utilizing only English measures, monolingually normed English measures, even though in this study we also had Spanish measures, but those measures were normed on native Spanish speakers in Mexico City, let's say, or Spain. Different context and than the population of English learners that are US-born, US citizens. So even if we use monolingual, quote unquote, Spanish measures, the norming population is not appropriate, if that makes sense. So one of the big questions that I had was, well, what if we were to use a different conceptualization than using monolingual norms as the yardstick? And the reason for that is that when we now think about the idea of academic expectations, it's really important to not continue to have monolingualism as the normative yardstick. And what I mean by that is that those of you who are well-versed or know enough about language development know that language knowledge among students who speak more than one language is distributed. That means that bilinguals, and this has been a recurring theme, bilinguals or trilinguals, multilinguals are not multiple monolinguals in one person, where you have the exact same level of proficiency across all language domains. So it's important to support concept development and content learning and not just proficiency in one language. So this leads to the need for accounting for the different linguistic resources that students bring to the table. And we're going to stick with English and Spanish now, again, knowing that there are many more languages spoken in the homes of English learners, but even with Spanish, which is the predominant language and has the most comparative assessments potentially available, we're still not where we need to be in my mind. So what continues to be the case is that monolingual assessments are common practice, and we get something like this. So let's say it's a vocabulary assessment. So we administer a vocabulary assessment, and here's an English only, like a PPVT, where it's a receptive. It's a quadrant of 4 pictures, and you say, can you point to the spoon or something like that? They just have to point. Well, if it's an English monolingual assessment, you must respond in which language? English. So that's it. So if it's a productive assessment where I'm showing you a picture of a tree, let's say, and I say, what is this? You must say tree. If you told me árbol, which is the Spanish label for tree, wrong. There's no such thing as a wrong language, but for, scoring purposes, it's wrong. And this has happened to me a gazillion times where students answer in the quote unquote wrong language. And it's frustrating because you think, oh my gosh, they know the concept, but you can't give them credit because it's a measure norm on English. Opposite happens as well. You're testing them in Spanish because you say, hey, this is good practice. They're from a Spanish speaking home. They speak Spanish. So let's assess their Spanish skills. You show them the picture of the árbol. They don't know árbol, but they tell you tree. Wrong, because the language they were supposed to answer in is in Spanish. Does that make sense? So it's really frustrating. And you often get a profile of low English skills, vocabulary skills, and low Spanish skills. Well, guess what? That clearly begs questions about, is there a disability? Is there something cognitively going on that's, an impairment? And this, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is it's kind of dated now, but still relevant. The black line is the monolingual national norms in both English and Spanish. So basically the national trajectory of how you expect vocabulary to develop in English and in Spanish. And then you have a blue and a red line. And these were all children from homes where Spanish was spoken, independent of their language proficiency. And we assess them on English vocab, which is the blue line, and on Spanish vocab. And you can see that in both languages, they are falling below national norms. They are definitely falling further in Spanish. Guess what? This was in a context in the East Coast where they were instructed in English only. So they were, even though at home they might speak Spanish or their family might speak Spanish, they're not using probably the academic vocabulary, Spanish vocabulary. So if you test them in Spanish, all well intended, you're not going to get a very good score. So this is the kind of profile that we tend to see over and over again of low Spanish vocab and even low English vocab compared to the national goal. So what we did and what we have been doing in my lab is utilizing what we're calling conceptually scored assessments. And this is an assessment that allows you to, that allows the student, I should say, that to respond in either English or Spanish. Sounds so obvious and easy, but it is not obvious and easy. And this is not what's in common practice at schools. So again, árbol example, you show the picture of the tree or árbol. It doesn't matter if they answer árbol, if they answer tree. The point is, do they know the concept? So I hope that kind of makes sense. And that's an assessment that is actually standardized on Spanish-English bilinguals in the US. And this is what now we get. You might say, what is all of this going on? We had 2 cohorts of students, one cohort that we followed from kindergarten through 2nd grade, that's red, and another cohort that we followed from 2nd grade through 4th grade. And we wanted to administer this conceptually scored vocabulary assessment to find out, how do they perform? Do these measures even matter? Or is it kind of useless to use a measure in which they can respond in both languages? And as you can see, you can almost not see the black lines underneath because the students are performing right on par with national expectations when they are allowed to utilize either English or Spanish to respond to these prompts, as opposed to respond only in English, respond only in Spanish. And the most important piece that I didn't have a chance to include here is that these type of measures are predictive of English reading comprehension above and beyond using English only measures. So we were really excited about this and felt like this could at minimum help with this paradigm shift about the challenges that English learners bring to the task of learning. And I think it's more a challenge of not having the adequate assessments to really understand what they bring to the task of learning. But we still have this question of disproportionality in special education. And I know I'm getting almost to 11 o'clock Eastern, but busy slide. But all I want to tell you from this slide is that these are some of the common disability categories, and about almost 15% of English learners are identified with having a disability. And there is this understudied intersection of English learner and SPED status. And the red part that I have highlighted here, I hope you can see the purple refers to students who have a specific learning disability that are not ELs, and the teal bluish represents students who have a specific learning disability that are ELs. And over, we get this profile that English learners are overrepresented disproportionately in a category like SLD, which subsumes reading difficulties. And now we have equity and idea regulations that give us guidance on disproportionality, but only our overrepresentation. And I'll get to that in a second. So this is really a lot to take in. I apologize. I try to do it as easy as I think I could, but this is from my newest work that literally was just accepted and will be published hopefully in print soon. But this is a study based on the state of Tennessee using Tennessee state level data that was really exploring the intersection of language and special education status, because Tennessee is one of these quote unquote new immigrant destination states in the American South, where there has been this unprecedented growth of population of students from linguistically diverse homes. And so we wanted to explore across a 10-year span from academic year 2009, 2010, all the way to academic year 2018-19, what is the representation of students by their English learner status in special education? So just kind of draw your attention to the orange circles. Those are the English learners. So this is a slide that's showing you unadjusted ratios and adjusted. You don't really need to pay attention to that. It's just whether we accounted for covariates or not. And I'm happy to talk offline with anyone who's interested in the analytics behind it. But basically, there's been this very fiery, contentious conversation in the field about whether students who are either racially, ethnically, or linguistically diverse are over or underrepresented in special education. So this is focused on language diversity in one state. And what we are finding is the black line represents NES, which is native English speakers. That's our comparison group. That's always going to be at 1. Anything above 1 would be that you have a higher likelihood of being represented. Anything below 1 would be that you have a lower likelihood. So just kind of pay attention to the orange circles, because those are the English learners. And here you see nothing too exciting. You're like, okay, across all special education categories, it looks like English learners are a little bit less likely to be represented than their native English speaking peers. The blue is the English proficient bilinguals, which we'll ignore for now. So you might think this is uninteresting, but when we now look at this category of SLD, which subsumes reading comprehension difficulties, this is what we get. When we don't adjust for anything on the left, we get what a lot of other folks have found, which is that English learners are more likely to be identified for SLD compared to their native English speaking peers. When we adjust for a lot of factors that contribute to potentially to this identification, like their reading achievement, their gender, their attendance, we now get a profile of potential underrepresentation of English learners in SLD. The next slide is SLI, specific language impairment, very similar to what you just saw for SLD. And then just because I couldn't help myself, I wanted to show you lower incidence categories. This is intellectual disability. And you can hopefully see that English learners are less likely to, compared to their native English speaking peers, to be identified for intellectual disability. And I hope that raises question like, well, how can that be? Isn't that like, shouldn't you see no difference? Yeah, you should see no difference. This is other health impairment. English learners less likely to be identified. And this is autism. English learners less likely to be identified. So all of this put together really gives us this kind of understanding that number one, in Tennessee, disproportionality is considered to be when you are 3 or more I'm sorry, it's 3.0 or above of risk ratios. We didn't get any evidence of disproportionality in terms of overrepresentation. What we did get is potential evidence, certainly not definitive, of underrepresentation of English proficient bilinguals and current ELs. So I won't bore you with too much detail, but the very last bullet I think is important, that we think there's something going on with social cultural factors that might be at play here, because let me just reiterate that there should be no difference in the general, it doesn't have to be exact, but in the general proportion of students who are identified across any disability categories by language status. In fact, language proficiency is an exclusionary factor that should not be associated with rates of identification. And what we are finding very consistently and very robustly, at least in this context, is that for whatever reason, English learners and students who are from a home where a language other than English is spoken, even if they're proficient in English, are less likely to be identified for almost all of the most common disability categories. So to kind of wrap up and open it up for some questions that we might have, and actually we'll have good time for questions because I was a little off with my time, is that I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to think about. For one, I hope that everyone can recognize that this population of students who are from a non-English language background or not exclusively English language background are a vastly diverse group. Yes, largely born US, they are largely US born and US citizens, but hundreds of languages are represented, as I mentioned, even though Spanish is the most common. And, you know, it sounds like a broken record, but I do have to underscore, because this is a common misunderstanding, that this population is most often instructed in English-only contexts across the nation. I really hope that you take this away, that you try to reflect on the common at-risk characterization that plagues this population of learners. Speaking another language or languages is not a risk factor. On the contrary, it's a linguistic resource, but we don't see it as such. So avoid framing conversations in terms of what we often, quote unquote, call challenges of working with this population of students. And as I hope you were able to see, and I can go back to that if I went through it too fast, is that if you use measures that really account for scientific understandings of bilingual language acquisition and development, you get a starkly different profile of what students can do than if you continue to use measures that are normed on English monolinguals. On the heels of the pandemic, it's super important. It has always been important, but this has been really underscored and highlighted even more, that we need to think about opportunities to learn for this population as opposed to their potential to learn. All students have the potential to learn, right? But not all have the equal opportunity to learn. And like all learners, NELB students can be successful and can really be rocking it, giftedness. But this is super depressing, but let me show you this. This is still a work in progress, in preparation. But in Tennessee, giftedness is also a disability in the sense of an exceptionality on the other end of the spectrum, and you get an actual IEP, and the process is really very well delineated on how you are identified. So what I'm showing you here is basically the odds, the probability of a student being placed in a gifted program, or being identified, I should say, as gifted. And at 1, as I mentioned before, that's our comparison. Those are students who are native English speakers. And what I hope you can see really clearly is at the very bottom, in like the little diamond shape, are the current English learners. So in Tennessee, students who are identified as English learners have a super low probability of being identified as gifted. So these difference in the line, and on contrast, if you see the line at the very top, which is never English learner, these are students who also come from a home where a language or languages other than English are spoken. So they're not English monolinguals. They have the highest likelihood of being identified as gifted, higher likelihood than their peers who are from an English-only home. So this, to me, brings up a gazillion questions and hypotheses of what might be happening. But the bottom line is that students who are English learners can be gifted. And this tends to show that if you don't have English language skills, it kind of precludes you from being identified as gifted. And in fact, at some years, there are fewer than 10 students across the state identified as gifted if they are English learners. So these differences by language status should not exist. All right, and in terms of reading instruction for this population, I hope I made a strong enough case, or if we can talk about it more, that similar factors influence their reading achievement as they do for students who are monolingual English speakers. For example, the language comprehension skills, the word reading skills. So there is absolutely a need, in my mind, for targeted and explicit word reading instruction. That's non-negotiable. They need to learn to read the printed words. But what we really are lacking at the most, in my view, is this sustained and purposeful language development support that is also non-negotiable for students to be able to make meaning from the text that they are reading. And a big issue here is that there are literally assessment limitations, but we at minimum need universal screening that also picks up on language skills and not just on word reading skills. And then, I ended with this, and I'll end with that here also, trying to go in order, that this intersection of language and special education status really needs a lot more attention, in particular, the referral process. So typically what happens is that teachers put in a referral or for potential screening for the need for an IEP if there's a suspected learning disability. And there is these new-ish equity regulations in IDEA, but those regulations only establish a system for identifying disproportionality in terms of overrepresentation. There is currently no federal guidance on what constitutes underrepresentation. So that is really problematic because the issue is misrepresentation. Are the students getting the services that they need, right? And so if you think about an English learner who might actually have the need for an IEP for a specific learning disability, and they are not being identified because for all good reasons, the teachers might be waiting for them to develop better English language skills. And then you go into your educational trajectory way too long, and it's really like a negative effect over time, where the gaps keep getting wider and wider. And so this issue of misrepresentation, I think, should be the central issue that we attend to, as opposed to worrying about, is it underrepresentation? Is it how can we have the best screening methods available to provide the kind of supports that students need independent of their language background? And so with that, I'm going to end and open it up for a discussion with you all. Thank you so much. Hope I didn't go too fast.
No, I'm like, I don't know about others on the call, but I am so enthralled with everything you're saying. I mean, it's so, this assessment piece is so huge, right? I mean, if we can get that right, like, I just feel like that would be such a game changer. And thank you for sharing you saw it here first, Delaware. I mean, come on, like, this is brand new research. So
it is literally like this week, I think.
Oh my gosh, we feel honored. Thank you. There's brilliant thinkers on this call. I can see people in the room here. What are you thinking, colleagues? I have a few questions, but I will open it up to you before I jump in and ask some things. So now you're on the spot, everyone. And Anastasia, you had some great ideas.
I have a question. I would like to know if in your research you ever divide long-term ELLs, like kids who were born and raised in one environment and kids who actually immigrate. To me, they seem like a very different population. And wondering in your data, like when it comes to gifted or a disability of some sort, I view those two groups as completely different. I'm middle school, so in Tennessee it might be 5th through 8th, but here it's 6th through 8. For the most part, they've been in school now 6 years. but most of them were born and raised in the same town. Both when I worked in Tennessee, I worked at Cookville and in here, just this huge population. By the time they reach middle school, I see them very different than kids that immigrated even in second or first grade, because they've had an extra 5 years in a largely English only environment. In their home, they might be different language, but the minute they leave, it's an almost exclusively English environment. So when you do research, do you ever use those two subsets, like see them differently?
Yeah, and so let me make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. It's if, like, do I disaggregate the groups by those that are long-term English learners and were not US born and are recent immigrants? Or can you clarify that part? Because there's
Okay,
so many different factors.
by the time you, at least for middle school, by the time you get here, so you're 14 years old, you've
Yeah.
been in school now 9 years,
Yeah.
and prior to school, you might have done Head Start or whatever.
Exactly.
But if you're in a fairly English only environment town, the minute you leave your household, you're already at an English environment.
Yeah.
Unlike Miami or
Yes.
Falls Church, Virginia, or something like
Yeah, or
that.
Chicago. Yeah.
Yeah, so like my students mentally, I see those children very differently and approach their academics very differently than someone who immigrated in second grade, because they might have almost reached that long-term ELL, but they came from a Spanish only environment up till age 7, and now they're reaching the point, they're long-term ELLs technically, but they are still immigrants and they haven't had the full advantage of someone who was born and raised in the environment.
Yeah, no, you're asking a great question. And actually and I have been across all 4 regions of the US and also used data sets that are nationally representative. And the vast majority are, as I mentioned, US born, US citizens. So disaggregating by recent immigrant status has not been that doable in most of the work that I've done, because in the context that I go in, we always do our best to get this demographic background information and find out the nativity of the children and of their parents. So we often account for, were the parents US born, is this first generation, second generation. But in that sense, it's been harder because there tends to be a very heavy profile of students who are effectively US born, US citizens. And when there are these populations, which certainly exist, that are more newly arrived immigrants, whether it's at the elementary grade years, early elementary or upper, or into the secondary grades, they tend to be a far smaller proportion. So analytically, it's hard to account for those, if that makes sense. So we can't do too much with that. But I completely agree with you that this is where this intersection to me becomes all the more relevant about what's happening, what is impeding, for lack of a better word, the ability of a certain group of students to pass this English proficiency assessment, right, and be reclassified as English proficient. And is it that this specific subgroup that becomes ultimately the long-term English learners are those students that we are missing because we have kind of been on this wait and see approach? And in all good intentions, right? To say like, well, I'm not going to refer because they don't have the English language skills yet. So we're going to work on that. So I don't have the answer. So I know it's not satisfying, but that is exactly the kind of research that is needed to better support this population. And I'm not suggesting, oh, let's identify them as having a disability because this is what right? It could well be that the quality of the instruction and the opportunities that they have, despite being in school for 7 or 8 years, are just not as demanding, and I mean that in a positive way, and as challenging as they could really tackle on. And as you saw from, this is one tiny study of teacher beliefs, but teachers sometimes have these deficit-oriented views. And if you compound that year after year, potentially, and every once in a while have a teacher who has these more asset-driven views, just having one every once in a while is probably not going to move the needle, if that makes sense. So we need this to be a lot more sustained. So that's why, I don't have the answer, but I think that at minimum, if we had a better understanding in the teacher workforce of what typical language and reading development is like in the population, even of monolingual English speakers, and then layer that with those that are negotiating another language, we might see some different outcomes. And again, the assessment issue is a big, big one because there are huge variations. And I anecdotally have heard from school psychologists that some use only word reading measures, some insert a little bit of language comprehension here and there, some decide, okay, we're going to try to assess the native language as well. So you get all sorts of differences in terms of who may or may not be identified, right? So that's an excellent question, and for sure an area that is of deep concern and something I want to continue exploring. So thank you. Anyone else? And it could be something I didn't talk about if you're curious about something else. I'm yours for a while, so.
I'm thinking back about, the language comprehension and it's sort of like the pragmatics around that and this notion about emphasizing oral language development as something we can do to shift some of the systemic issue. Like I see so much of this as like a system problem, not a kid problem, right? That's what a big takeaway that I'm getting.
Melissa,
So I'm like that's the optimism for me, is that that's partway in our sphere of influence that we can change. It is our sphere of influence that we can change right now as leaders and educators and knowledge producers in the field, such as yourself. So I was wondering if there was anything to weigh in on around that oral language development. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the hardest thing to penetrate. And I know that may sound like, oh, great. But again, if you think about the strands or the simple view of reading, and at minimum, we can agree that students need to read the words. Okay, there is quite a bit of support instructionally and material to help students, and some struggle significantly, right? So I'm not underestimating the complexity of it, but to learn the letters and the sounds. But there is a finite number of English letters and corresponding sounds. That is so opposite of language comprehension, which is infinite. For one, I would never say I know all of the words in the English language and just have 100% mastery, because language is ever changing and we adopt new terms, et cetera, right, into our vocabulary and lexical items. So that's a totally different ballgame. And so what I really emphasize, so I hope I'm still on your same thread, Melissa, in terms of supporting the oral language and language development domain, is that parents, of course, as you might imagine, often ask me, what can I do for the reading development of my children when they know that this is the line of work that I'm engaged in? And I tell them to talk to their child. That might sound like, so what, that's it? I'm not a big proponent of go and get those flashcards and do the, identify that's fine and great. If you're engaging with them and talking because you have your magnet letters, go for it, because you're using language and you're invested in spending time with your child. That's beautiful. If you're reading books, of course, that's great, but you can't assume literacy across all cultures and families, right? And there's different levels of literacy. So I'm not going to say make sure you read to them every night. Having exposure to books is great, and that would be a big plus. But at the basic level, I think the use of the oral language, and in some cultures and families, storytelling is a big thing. That's excellent. That's what exactly like story structure, and what we want students to be attuned to, understand what's happening when and where, and ask questions, going to the grocery store, stuff that sounds like low-hanging fruit that goes a super long way. Because the way you amass language knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, whatever you want to call it, takes time. You cannot say, all right, today I'm going to do this lesson and we're going to just get everything we needed in terms of language development. It's a slow process, which is why we don't have assessments like we do for word recognition, where you can assess vocabulary every day and progress monitor and say oh, I can see this upward trajectory, because that's not how language works. It takes time and effort. And we want to see results yesterday. That's not how it works. So reading comprehension requires this very big investment on developing strong conceptual understanding, strong background knowledge, that can only happen with a lot of opportunities to do that. So this is why, as one example, when we think about children who are from lower income homes that tend to have lower language skills, well, that often makes sense because they may not be going on a vacation to Europe. I'm just going to use that as an example, where you get on an airplane, you know what an overhead compartment is, you know that you're changing time zones, all of these conceptual things that you kind of have to live and experience, right? And now with technology, there's a lot of opportunity to bring those to life without, kind of literally being yourself in that environment. But I hope you get what I mean. There may be fewer opportunities for dinner side conversations where you're talking about your day because the context in which you're living might be different. But all of those experiences really are building on each other over time. And that doesn't mean teachers, I don't mean to depress you and say like, oh, well, we can't do anything. By the time they enter school, they either have this knowledge base or they don't. That's true in one aspect, that their children enter formal schooling with varying levels of language comprehension knowledge, for example, but there's a lot that can be done in the classroom. That being said, we don't have these packaged curriculum that are focused on conceptual and language development. You might say, well, yes, because when we teach science and when we teach social studies, this is where we're bringing it in. And that's true, but think about the proportion of the day that's spent in those content areas, as opposed to the percentage of the day that is spent in ELA, and particularly on word recognition skills, and not necessarily on language development. So there needs to be a lot more in terms of what's available to teachers, because we can't just say, oh, please, Michelle, use strong academic language and make sure that you're like really challenging your students without giving you anything to utilize, if that makes sense. So I'm going to pause there because I said a lot. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too much, but
I actually have a question.
Yeah, please.
Like right about what you were just talking about, because I know we have so many students and we're testing, right? We test all the time. We test to figure out where they are. We test benchmarking. We're doing all these different things. I'm a coach, by the way, so I work with teachers primarily.
Okay.
So, but I'm just thinking about what you were saying in the beginning when you shared that when we have students maybe answer the question in Spanish on an English only test, what would that look like if we scored it a different way? Like, would you be on board with attempting to score in both ways and saying like, well, if they offer the word that was correct in Spanish, and we know that it's correct in Spanish because árbol is tree, we know that, and we took that as saying, okay, well, they know that word, so they don't know it in English yet, but they know it in Spanish. How would that impact your data, like your collection of their scores? Like what would you think that might do?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it as I understand it, but if I'm off base from what you were trying to ask, correct me. Okay.
Sure.
So and one thing that I didn't explain is that in a practical level, it's so useful, I think, to try and move toward this use of either language or whatever languages this child speaks, because it is a qualitatively different task for a student to know a concept in a given language and have to only learn the label. Let's continue with their árbol. So they know árbol in Spanish. They haven't learned the lexical label tree in English yet, but conceptually they know it. So that's a far easier task, as if they rather than a student who does not have a knowledge base or a conceptual understanding of the concept of a tree in any language, right? So instructionally, what that would mean to me, and what I would say is that if teachers have a better understanding of whether it's that they need to teach more labels for concepts that are already known versus they need to teach the concept and the label, those are two hugely different tasks, if that makes sense. And so
Absolutely.
this is where it becomes so useful, even if it's not about how am I going to score it and what percentile I'm going to give you. But I think and hope, and I'm optimistic in nature, that we're going to move in a direction where we are attending more to these issues of being responsive to what students bring to the task of learning. So it just does not, in my mind, make sense to continue to test a student who is developing English proficiency and only assess them in English. And if we are going to do that because of X, Y, and Z reasons, at minimum, contextualize your findings and say, this is a slice of what they know, because we are acknowledging that we are not assessing in X, Y, or Z languages that they may know, because that can change the mindset of teachers. Because if you keep seeing over and over results of second percentile, fifth percentile, you're like, oh, wow, something, it kind of like flattens you out and makes you feel like there's nothing you can do. So at least acknowledging that this is only a slice, and I know that may sound like, oh, that's not good enough. Well, that's a starting point at least,
No,
right?
that's a great point. Yeah, because
Acknowledgement.
I'm thinking of like specific students in you know, they tell us to do the thing where you know, target students in your mind. So you're always
Yeah.
keeping them in your head when we're doing these things and we're having these conversations. And I'm thinking about some of the students in a second grade classroom right now with a new teacher that I've been working with all year. She's fantastic. She's doing a great job. And she is learning a lot about English learners and how to handle that and how to help them. But
Yeah.
just thinking about some of the specific, like looking at their scores, and she's like, how do I tell if this is a learning issue or if this is a language issue? And we're like, I'm like, this is a big messy thing. It's going to take a while for us to untangle it. So we're just going to keep looking at all the different pieces, every part of that child, not just one element. We're not looking at one score and saying, because they didn't do well on this test, that's it. We're just going to throw it out and say, all right, well, that's who they are. So I have been helping her like look at all the different data and all the different aspects and gathering stuff from this place and that place and trying to look at it as a whole picture of the student instead of just saying, they don't know enough English to do it. So we're just going to assume that they can't.
That's great, Michelle. And the
yeah.
thing is that I've mentioned, I hope this doesn't sound super repetitive, but the issue I have when teachers not teachers themselves, but like the district, because of assessment limitations, utilize an assessment in the child's native language, like say Spanish, you have to keep in mind that those assessments are usually normed, again, on monolingual Spanish speakers in a different context. So while that is a good idea and better than nothing, you might still get this profile of low. So we're going to have to move in the direction of utilizing assessments that are normed on the population they were intended to be used with.
Yes, thank you. That's so hard because we do
It
have
is so hard,
yeah,
and it
because
is
we
just
have
like going to take
yeah.
time.
Like
Yeah.
just to even have those test materials that even exist, because
Oh my
I know
gosh.
our dual language schools, a lot of them have been asking questions about, well, I have these kids come in, I don't know where they are in Spanish. How am I supposed to help them transfer their skills into English if I don't know where they are in Spanish? And it's just not making sense. Sometimes they can do. Some of them have been well educated and some of them come with a wealth of knowledge in Spanish.
Yes.
And some of them have been in a barrio for like their
Exactly.
entire are on a farm and they have no experience and they have very limited educational experiences. So depending on the student and where they come in, it can vastly differ. Obviously, all of our MLOs are vastly different and we have to look at it in that way. But it's nice to hear from someone who's doing the studies that it's understood that this is an issue and that there's a concern and
Oh,
that we have these
and
problems.
in fact, Michelle, we have a study, I don't want to jinx it, that might get funded that is going to look exactly at this issue and compare these different conceptualizations of language measures that are monolingual English, monolingual Spanish, and conceptually normed in terms of predicting later reading comprehension outcomes and who goes on to be identified as needing special education services. So hopefully that'll happen.
Fingers crossed. I hope that happens because that would be amazing.
Sure.
Yeah.
And yesterday, this question came up about, what I mentioned, the process of identifying ELs. And I have to tell you that students who are monolingual English speakers often will not pass this English proficiency assessment intended to identify English learners, because as a nation, we're just not doing such a super job of supporting language comprehension development. And it can be a student who is monolingual English speaking that for X number of reasons also has not had the opportunity to develop really strong academic language skills prior to formal school entry. So their profile could look very similar to a student who is an English learner, but we're not capturing that population because it's assumed that they have adequate English language skills and academic English language skills. But we can see from NAEP data as one indicator that as a nation, students are not faring very well in terms of making meaning from the text that they are reading, even without disaggregating by subgroup.
Yeah, I agree with that because just from my own experiences of screening students, I have screened students who are coming in as just part of our job, is to do the screeners.
Yeah.
So I would sit down with a student who was maybe a kindergartner and they can speak English. They're speaking English with me the entire time, but they don't know the academic language they need to pass the
totally
test.
Different ballgame.
So they still get flagged as English learners, even though their English is I mean, they can speak English, but they don't have the
Right.
academic language that they need to, in order to pass the standardized test. So
Yeah.
I felt like, oh, what am I supposed to do? I
Mhm.
mean, obviously they're still going to qualify as an English learner, whether they are or not. You know, like everyone
Yeah,
is still learning academic language. And that was something that I learned
absolutely. Yeah.
at a previous, conference, was that we talked about academic language is a new language for everyone.
Yes.
So none
Yeah,
of our
we
students
don't
come
talk
in.
the way that textbooks
No,
structure the
right. None of
language,
our
right, for
students
the
are
most
coming
part.
into school like that, with that
Right.
knowledge. So it's just really refreshing and wonderful to hear
Yeah.
from someone.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Luis,
think
did you
about,
have Luis, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just have, do you know what population the MAPS test in Spanish is normed on?
I don't.
Okay,
It
that's,
depends. I guess it depends when it was normed or when it was developed, because more and more, and this is where I said that we're moving, I think and hope, in the right direction. There is more attention psychometrically in terms of what is the norming population that we are utilizing. I mean, if we think about like back in the day, right? The majority was middle-class white children that are monolingual English speakers that were the norming sample. And that's shifting, as we understand what the demographics of the school age population is now. But I'm not sure. A lot of these, native language assessments continue to be normed in contexts that are monolingual Spanish speakers.
wow. It's just so amazing. There's so many, so many layers to this. I keep thinking back to these conversations I've been participating with Claude and Jim Cummins, like around, I really like the way you chopped it between like early elementary, that fourth grade slump or whatever, but this
Yeah.
notion of literacy saturation early on, and like how, like I've been thinking about this in terms of like high quality instructional materials that Delaware is implementing. They're in the midst of this like very large statewide initiative around that. And I talked to Nicole Harrison at length on this. She's on the call right now. And like replicating that at the secondary level, thinking about upper elementary, like what kind of literacy saturation needs to happen in terms of, you mentioned Scarborough's rope, or maybe it's the active view of reading, whatever way we're thinking about it, that we're actively incorporating foundational literacy components in a saturated way that helps to access grade level core materials and perhaps assessments by extension. But there's something there. And I know for a fact that Nicole and I grapple with this all the time.
Yeah, no, it is. In fact,
Also during the semester.
yesterday I teach the intro reading course in the special ed department. So these are undergrads, and I have them do the typical kind of assignments like a progress monitoring tool, et cetera. And most of these are word reading skills, as I mentioned, because of the difficulty of tracking language development in a very short span of time. But one of them happens to be placed in a secondary classroom, the only one. So everyone's like, because usually it's elementary, and so everyone's intrigued, like, oh, what are you learning from? And these are all students. They're working with students that are all struggling in this area that have a learning disability. And it was almost like if I had put her up to the task. But when she presented yesterday, it was really about underscoring the difficulty that the 8th grade student she's working with is not necessarily having a lot of trouble at the word reading level. Like, she needs more help with fluency, but it's with the vocabulary, and that she would encounter these words, not only multisyllabic words, right? But words that she just said, like, oh, I have never seen this word before. I just didn't even know that this is how it's spelled and what it means. So, we got into this whole conversation and about the need for this language support and this vocabulary support. That's because that's why I said it seemed like I had framed this, because it really is about like these strands where language comprehension ends up being really the differentiator over time. Students who have these stronger language comprehension skills tend to be the ones that are able to make meaning from that text that they're reading post elementary grade years and beyond. And those that have more limitations at the language comprehension level, that tends to be the differentiating factor, and the ones that are struggling, which makes all the sense in the world, right? And so to your question, Melissa, of what to do about it, that's where we're stuck, because there are such few. I was part of a group that selected a specific intervention focused on academic language development that is probably going to conclude soon, but it's one of the few. You can't imagine. There was a call out for who has some curriculum, some instructional programs that are really anchored on supporting academic language development at the secondary grade years. And that even included fourth grade, right?
Yeah.
Upper elementary and above. And it was like silent from the field, because there is just not a lot. So we're like kind of stuck in this muddied situation where there's assessment limitations, there's curriculum limitations. And so what can we expect classrooms to really be able to do?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. And you've given us so much to emphasize in the meantime, right? Where we're in the midst of developing the research, but I just, there are so many components with the language comprehension and thinking about assessments differently, and really looking at content that learners bring, the asset space. I don't know how many people caught it, but that belief piece that you showed, I mean, I think that's what's missing from this next level of conversation about the science of reading and whatever we're going to call it, multilingual terms. Like, if we don't address that belief system.
Oh my God, I know. And some people think like, oh, that seems so like wishy-washy. Like, no, I think that's so important. When I consult for folks across a whole host of different things, I tell them like, there's so many myths and misconceptions that just need to be addressed. And that includes oftentimes my colleagues in academia who just really conceptualize this population in a very homogeneous way. And when they learn certain things, it's like, what? Wait, what? And it's true. And I couldn't help but look at the comment that you posted about the gifted referral and they can't pass the test. Like, that is so awful, but so true, unfortunately, of what often happens. And
then I asked if, couldn't they have the test in their language? Well, we're not going to instruct them in their language.
Oh my gosh. But see, that is exactly
I was so my heart bled.
Yeah, because that is basically saying, in order to be gifted, you must be English proficient. Hopefully that sounds ridiculous to everyone, but it's just, what are we saying? What are we doing? And so this, again, perpetuates this deficit mindset, 100%.
But I could see that for immigrant students. But again, when you're talking about long-term ELL students that haven't passed the WIDA, I could see why honors classes and gifted classes would seem not realistic. Like, if you can't pass the WIDA, would you be going in, would we be referring you to honors or something like that?
Oh,
so again, this is where the immigrant versus child born
Yes.
here, there's a whole different world between the two of them.
Yes, yeah. And I think in addition to that, well, first of all, most gifted identification happens in the elementary grade years. And then we get into the honors classes, AP, et cetera, later on. But there's also students who are twice exceptional, right? And it becomes even fewer who are by language diversity, that are linguistically diverse, that are even candidates for thinking about being twice exceptional. And again, it's not like a blame game, but it's because it's so difficult to disentangle these things, but it's much easier comparatively to do it with a child who is an English monolingual or has parents who can advocate for that, because these referrals and the way that happen are oftentimes teachers, but many times it's parent referral.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, the whole gifted thing is a whole other topic to wrap our heads around. But I think the big takeaway is what's missing here is the system is designed to get the results that it was designed to get, and it's the system that we have to start to dismantle and take the information that we know and completely revise the way that we view learners, period. this kind of conversation helps us to build that knowledge base. And we thank you for your time. If you can believe it, we are at time.
Oh my gosh, so
right
fast.
at it,
Well,
like,
and I
right
welcome anyone to
dot.
email me separately. I'd be happy to engage in more. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
What an incredible opportunity. Sign up for that 2 p.m. session on Sketch. Go in and put your name for the focus group, because we can add this to the list of things that need to be done. We will definitely consider or continue the conversation. Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Bye-bye.